All right, ready for another Cove short? AirGap this time. Ooh, ah. So the myth is AirGap keeps your copies isolated. The reality is, in computer technologies, devices need to be connected, so therefore it's always exploitable. All we can do is minimize that exposure. So let's talk about what is it, right? Let's demystify the buzzword AirGap. It's really a measure to physically isolate one device on a separate network from an unsecured network. And so there are different methods, technologies that vendors would throw at it. The last two are a little bit esoteric, but there are solutions like zero trust cryptography or data diodes, right? But they are very rarely used, and they're frankly impractical for most common backup implementations, right? So the logical air gapping using things like an if config are the most commonly used. And what we would see is this high-level topology. You got a production network on the left. So this is all your sources, workstations, servers, switches, storage, backup target, backup server, and so forth. All that's on a network that we would consider untrusted because essentially a bad actor can get to it. That's the assumption we're going to make. So the first thing we need to do is build a vault. The vault net is simply just a dark site. Think of it as a dark site, dedicated network. And then I throw a bunch of infrastructure in there, storage, right, for my copies, backup infrastructure, probably server, management server, right? And then, of course, we need some networking, so network switch. That's a reasonable sort of basic building block. So then I'm off to the races. I built this thing. I sized it. Now I need to worry about how do I get the data in the vault? And that's what I would manage in a separate policy, right? So generally speaking, you wouldn't have the same policy that I use in the backup in terms of how often, what's the backup frequency and retention apply to the vault as well, right? Because you're just doubling your investment. So likely I would have a looser backup frequency and a shorter retention to minimize my costs. Hence, I need to manage a separate policy. Okay, so the data comes in, and this is the part where in that data path, that first line in red, I would think about how do I secure that, right? So this is where that link management business and these other gymnastics would come in order to minimize my attack surface. Now, of course, if the link is open, once I synchronize data, that exposure is there. But unless I'm taking in data, it's at least the fiber is dark, but it's still connected. And if it's still connected, hackers can still use a lower level attack to find their way into the vault and do damage. But it's more secure. Management. So that's the next one up. That's the control path. So, how do I actually securely get access to the management server? So if I want to do a recovery, if I want to set my policies so that I can do that. Well, it needs to be secured as well. But I'm not going to do an air gap there because it's going to be costly. So probably I'm going to have a jump server of sorts and restrictive access credentials in order to get to it so I can do my job, right? And then lastly, reporting, right? Because if I live in the on-premises first world, the assumption I'm going to make is that you're going to likely do an on-premises first reporting, which means I need to push some of those statistics out of the vault back out into my aggregation dashboard, right? So reporting is an important piece. I need to know what's going on in the vault, just like I need to know what's going on in the production network, and that too needs to be secured. This is actually a good use case for a data diode because it's not performance sensitive, but of course it adds a tremendous amount of cost. Now, what am I going to get out of this? Better isolation, reduced attack surface. That's a good thing. Now, what we need to give up, though, is this notion that we think now it's all good, it's completely isolated. No, it's still connected because you still have 3 cables going from left to right and back. So, therefore it's still exploitable, but it is a smaller attack surface without a doubt. I also have additional costs, greater infrastructure costs, server, compute, switching, networking, right? And then, of course, dollar per gig because the data needs to be stored there. And then lastly, I have a whole bunch of complexity that I just invited, which adds man hours, design. How do I design it? What's the right data? How do I size this thing? And then of course separate policies, right? So I'm going to have to manage that policy separate from the backup policy. So now I have to manage two policies instead of one. And then lastly, the biggest impediment used to be for us, like, how do I patch this thing? Because having a vault as the last line of defense, but having it not be patched, that's insane. So therefore, I need to find a very good and easy way. There's no easy way to patch infrastructure that's in the dark side because it's highly restricted. That's the whole point of the dark side. Now, there's a better way. Let's just have a secure design by default. It's called Cove. And so if I can actually just provide that isolation by default by moving the data directly into our highly secure enabled data center, that's a good thing. We're going to move it securely. We're going to establish a trust. We're going to make sure that this data that we reduce the likelihood of a man-in-the-middle attack and so forth, right? But the big benefit here in terms of gets is we dramatically reduce complexity. One policy instead of two. You don't need to worry about a jump server. You log into the console with the right elevated privileges. You don't have to worry about securing a reverse reporting link. The reporting happens in the central dashboard. And then lastly, you don't worry about patching and upgrading. It is done for you, and it is done at a higher degree of frequency than you can ever do if you have to coordinate with a vendor that's going to give you those software updates, right? So the only pushback you might get from a customer is, well, you don't have the 321 copies by default. I lead a lot of copies, and Veeam taught me this, and it's great. Well, the reality is you can do that, but you're right. We do not sell you 3 copies out of the box as much as we would like to. We sell you 1, and then you can augment that strategy by adding additional copies through the local speed vault or standby image if you so choose. So you can actually be very strategic about, I just need additional copies for a subset of my workloads as an example, and then remediate that way. So it's a much more flexible approach, but the key here is avoid buying into buzzwords like air gapping and so forth. Make an investment in a solution that provides isolation by default, and that is something that actually still a single employee or part-time employee can manage end to end. Thanks a lot. See you next time.